done. I know you've mentioned that you're a teacher, you worked in education. Tell me about some of the stuff you've done in your community as an educator.
Well, the thing here in Missouri is teachers are so low paid. I think we're the 49th lowest paying state in the nation for teachers. And that's a shame because this is my 16th year in education. And um, I was drawn to it because I had an eighth grade basketball coach who was a mentor to me as an eighth grader. Um, I'll never forget, we did this lesson. He used to do these things called life skills lessons every day. And he did this one on finding your identity. And as an eighth grader, I'm like, well, I know my name, I know my identity. And he said, that's not what I'm talking about here. And it wasn't until a few years later in high school I started thinking back about it. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. I get what he's talking about. Be yourself, be your true person. Don't be a follower. Don't be like, we call marks in the business. Don't be
Yeah.
a mark, be yourself. And that stuck with me my entire life. And he was such a great mentor to me. He was actually the best man in my wedding 15 years ago.
Wow.
And so I decided, after getting my journalism degree, after a couple of years, I'm like, I'm going to go back to school and get an education degree because I want to coach, I want to teach, I want to have the impact on kids that this guy had on me. And so I did that, and I started out in the inner city of St. Louis, and one of the poorest schools you could think of, and it was rough, man. I was right between blood and crip territory. Fights every day, probably 3, 4, 5 fights a day. And these were seventh and eighth graders.
Wow.
Um, Stayed there for 2 years coaching and started the basketball program, which after 2 years, we were beating JV teams. My eighth grade team would go into a JV team's gym and put 100 points on them.
Mm.
That's how good we were. But we kept these kids from, getting involved in the gang life. And, so from there, I went kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. I went to rural Missouri and coached there and worked with those kids. And, now that I'm a little older and seeing some of these kids who are now 29, 30 years old with kids and getting married, and I'll be out somewhere and they'll come up and start talking to me. And it really gives me just a positive vibe just to know that, I had some type of an impact on their life, whether it be, and most of the time it's because I was just nice to them. And I'm a joke teller. I like to talk, and tell stories, and they love that about my class. They love to hear all about my journalism background and working with wrestlers and things like that. They think it's so cool. And that's what they remember, and, I'm not going to get upset that they don't remember anything about my English subject that I taught, but they remember my stories, which is still cool, So I think just knowing that I have a positive impact on a lot of these students' lives, no matter how minor it may be, but the fact that they can think back and have a positive memory of their teenage years when it's probably some of the toughest times in their lives,
Hmm.
and I was a part of that makes me feel pretty good. The teachers that helped me as a kid, and there were a couple, obviously my eighth grade history teacher, John, was the big one, but I can think of a seventh grade English teacher. I can think of a fourth grade teacher who I loved, but here's the funny thing. There was an algebra teacher I had in eighth grade who I hated, could not
Hmm.
stand him. He
Hmm.
gave me a 30% in the class. It was a special class that somehow I got picked to be in because I was good in math at the time. And then after that, I was horrible in math. But he was the worst. At the time, I thought he was the worst teacher. He would give me 50 problems a night. And he always had this saying. He was from New Jersey, and being in the Midwest, his accent really stuck out. And he'd always say, "It's your grade, not mine." And I'll never forget, one day I muttered that to a student. I'm like, Jesus, man. I'm like, Mr. Martin's rubbing off on me. But he passed away a few years back. And I remember thinking, I'm like, he really was a great teacher. He taught me a lot about just doing the work. Even though I wasn't doing it right and doing it well, I put in the work. Um, and then I thought about one of the worst teachers that a bad experience with teaching. And I tell my students this. I had written this 10-page paper as a sophomore in high school for an English class. And I had worked like crazy on it. It was about defending sexist lyrics in rap music. Basically how rap music was coming under fire back then for bad lyrics. And, they were out busting all the CDs. All the government officials were doing that. And So I wrote a paper basically defending freedom of speech, 10 pages. I had another teacher edit it. I worked like crazy on it. And I got it back from this English teacher, and it was a C minus, which broke my heart. And at the bottom, she wrote, "You need to find a new profession. You will never work in media." And at first, I was really mad about it. I'm like, I wanted to go like tell her off. And I went home and I told my mom, and my mom really didn't do nothing about it. So I went to my grandfather, and I think I was in tears over it. I'm like, I really worked hard on this. This ain't right. Why would this lady tell me this? And he goes, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" I said, "What do you mean?" And I'm thinking, well, do you want me to go like pop her tires on her car or something or what? He's like, "No, what are you going to do about it to prove her wrong?" And from that day on, I kept that essay in a locker, or I kept it above my bed, and I would look at it every day as a motivator to prove her wrong, you know. And I'll never forget, one night I was coming home from a Blues game. I had just covered the Blues for an outlet here in St. Louis, and she was on the train. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Housewright, how you doing?" And I just held up my press pass. I said, "Boom, I work in the media." And I just walked away. I didn't say hi to her. I was like, no, man, because, you know, I would never do that to a student, no matter how much they made me mad. And there's been some that, man, there's some that I can't tolerate. Like, I just wish would go away. But I would never crush their hopes and dreams, no matter how ridiculous they may be.
Yeah.
You know, I always tell my students, if you want to do it, if you can dream about it, you can do it. No matter how ridiculous it may seem, I'm never going to crush a dream because of that experience I had. And that's always stuck with me. And I